Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Pulse of the Movement, Game-Changing Solutions from the Leading Edge. I'm your host, Jay Markert, and this monthly webcast, we feature conversations with leaders in the movement, transformational technologies, vital tools for creating a thriving world. And I'm happy to have our guest this week, Dr. Chong. Thank you for joining us, Chong.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure.
So the title of this episode, we're going to be talking about how to transition to a just and sustainable monetary system. Dr. Chong is the founder of Baybucks, which is a local currency system in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he has a lot of experience and thoughts on transitioning to a just and sustainable monetary system using local currencies. So I'm going to give Chong a little bit of an introduction, and then Chong, you can say a little more about yourself and how you got into this work and what your passion is around it. And then we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Right, thank you.
So, Dr. Chong started life as an academic. He has taught at Stanford and National University of Singapore. After leaving academia, he worked in real estate development in Singapore, and later came back to the San Francisco Bay Area and worked in HIV prevention in San Francisco. Outside of work, he has been an activist for over 20 years, working in the areas of Asian democracy, press freedom, censorship, and after coming to the United States in the area of equal rights and sustainability. After the 2008 financial crisis, Chong began studying our financial and monetary systems and quickly came to realize that these systems are the root causes of some of the most pressing problems facing the world today. So Chong started Baybucks as a transition San Francisco project and in hopes of reversing the rising trends of inequality and making the San Francisco Bay Area more resilient. Chong received his BA in computer science from Cambridge University and his PhD in Chinese literature from Stanford University. So thank you, Chong, again for being with us. That's quite a very unique and interesting background you have.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, looking forward.
So before you get into your presentation, I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit how you got into this work of local currency. From shifting from your academic background, and what was it that really got you doing this work, and why did you found Baybucks?
Sure. The impetus really started from the 2008 financial crisis. So I've worked for quite a while and had some savings, and that was on that basis that I was able to come back to the Bay Area and live here because I love this area. But I came back in 2007, and so very soon this whole massive crisis hit. And I remember on that fateful day, sitting in front of the computer and watching basically my retirement savings melting away, and was a very traumatic experience. Luckily, I got up still, but it was extremely traumatic, and I'm sure this is not a unique story. So many people have suffered a similar, a much worse loss than me. But that got me thinking about what went wrong, because it was so different from my understanding of what saving for retirement means, what our financial system means, what our economy means. And at the same time, of course, a massive amount of discussion kind of burst forth in the Stanford alumni mailing list. So all of us were thinking, like, what the hell happened to us? And through that discussion, that's when I started really learning from other folks who are more the economist type among us, who started talking more about what happened, what the federal government's doing, what the Fed is doing, what the banks are doing, what our news at that time was not telling us. And from there, I did a lot more reading, a lot more research, and to my horror, began to understand our current financial and monetary system, which actually led to caused a whole year of depression. But the fortunate thing is, in the course of reading, I actually found writers who are more positive and hopeful, among them Bernard Lieta and Thomas Greco and many others. And so it's through their work that I realized there is a solution. In fact, the solution has been around for a long time and has proven to work, but had been variously suppressed or just not known. And so that got me excited that there's something we can do. And that was the reason why I started designing and eventually started Baybucks.
Great, thank you so much for your good work. Well, I really look forward to just diving in and learning more about this system and what is wrong with it and what are the solutions. So I invite you just to shift into your presentation and give us the breakdown.
Well, I'd be delighted. So first, let me share my screen with everyone. Give me a moment. And all right, so can you see the PowerPoint now?
Okay. Yep, looks good to go.
Okay, so good. So the topic then, what I really want to talk about is how to transition to a just and sustainable monetary system. It's basically based on my experience of starting Baybucks and running it over the last 3 years. And I'll be covering first why we want to do it. Why is very important. It's only by knowing why that we can actually start making decisions and start knowing where to go. So I'm making 3 very basic claims. Our current economic system is environmentally destructive, socially unjust, and systematically unsustainable. So that's my first claim. I think most of you are pretty okay with that, but I'll go into a little more detail to convince you. And based on that, the next point is we must know that our monetary system is what's really driving our economic system. Usually we talk about capitalism and how greed and capitalism is ruining us. But at the basis, at the foundation of capitalism and all that greed is actually our monetary system. And I'll explain a little more in this talk as well. And finally, the last conclusion from these 2 points is that we cannot successfully transition to a new economy without also transitioning to a new just and sustainable monetary system. And this is actually the most critical point because in the work I've been doing so far, what I'm noticing is there's a lot of energy around building a more sustainable food system, a better access, racial justice, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of energy and a lot of really good work surrounding that. But most of these work have a blind spot, which is that they're building it on top of our current monetary and financial system. They still depends on the US dollar, it still depends on bank, and it still depends on a lot of the system. That was the cause of so much crisis and problem in recent memories. And because of that, these efforts will always find a headwind going against them. And so what I'm really trying to say today is that if we truly want to make a change, a really fundamental change that can sustain us far into the future, we cannot ignore the monetary system. It is something difficult to understand and wrap our brains around it, but until we do, we'll always be controlled by it and we will not be our own master. So first, let me substantiate my 3 points. First, currently we have an environmentally destructive monetary system. How is that? Well, money right now is created by private banks as interest-bearing debt. They create the debt, but they don't create the interest that's required to pay it. So the money to pay interest comes from other people's debt principal. Now, this kind of system means that we will have an increasing debt in order to keep the system afloat. The moment we don't have enough, what happens is depression and great pains. And as we saw in 2008, that's what happened. When there was so much debt created for the subprime mortgage, and then suddenly people were not able to pay their ballooning interest, a lot of default happened, and suddenly the whole system seized up, and it causes enormous pain. A lot of people lost their job, lost their pension, and so on. So this is not something we want. But we are in it, and we don't want the pains, we don't want the depression, so we want the government to do something about it. And so what happened? They came and bailed it out. And by bailing it out and without changing the fundamental system, we have it still in place. So we still now have even more debt, which is driving the need for even more economic activities in order to generate the money to pay the interest on these debt, which is driving more consumption, which in turn drive resource extraction. It drives the burning of oil and fossil fuel, eventually it leads to resource depletion and climate change. This is the kind of system we have right now. And we are all part of it, and we are implicit in keeping it going, because the moment it doesn't work, there will be a hue and cry, there'll be public protest, and we'll demand government to step in and bail it out and make it continue to work. And so we are all complicit, in fact, in climate change. In given such a system which demands infinite growth, it is impossible to have a steady state economy where growth is not quantitative but qualitative. So this makes what we call an ideal state, a sustainable development, impossible. And that is a very critical point. We all want sustainable development, truly sustainable development, but as long as we keep our current monetary and financial system, it is actually impossible to do it. Mr. Dahl, who is a former VP of Exxon for Norway, says it best, I think. He says, socialism collapsed because it did not allow prices to tell the economic truth. And capitalism may collapse because it does not allow prices to tell the ecological truth. And what I'm advocating today is that it's time for us to start making prices tell the ecological truth, and how we can do that. Second point that I mentioned previously was that our current system is also socially unjust. All of us agree, but let me give you some data point. The daily transaction volume of the global foreign exchange market is now about $4 trillion per day transacted, $4 trillion. But the global total daily import and export of goods and services is 2% of this figure. That means 98% of the global forex exchange market is speculation. Another data point, the total global outstanding derivative trade is now, was in 2014, $693 trillion, which is 9 times global annual GDP. There's no way the world can bail out the derivative trade market. If that crashes, it brings everything down. And the worst thing is current law makes the derivative trade the number one to be paid. That means when things go south, when there's a lot of creditors and not enough money around to pay people, the derivative traders get paid first before anyone else. And since there are 9 times global GDP, do you think there'll be any money left for anyone else after the derivative trader gets all their payment? That's it. They'll crash everything. And because there's so much speculation in the financial market, and these people are making bets on the productivity of the real economy in order to make money. And so you imagine the real economy is actually making profits and making money to sustain us all, but most of it is siphoned off by the financial market and the speculative trade. And that is the reason why seeing the concentration of wealth in the 0.1% and nothing left for everyone else. So this is what I mean when it's socially unjust. Our system as it currently stands rewards financial speculation and punishes real production. And this is if you remember the 2008 crisis that we all experienced, the total bank rescue cost is 14.4 trillion. And do you know what the total US GDP is in 2007, just before the crash? It was 16 trillion. That means United States of America spent almost an entire year of GDP to rescue the private banks. And that causes our deficit to skyrocket. What's happening then when the government takes on so much public debt in order to bail out private banks? This is when it really starts rubbing insult into injury. The private right-wing think tank, seeing what this happening, are now advocating that the federal government must start selling its assets in order to pay down this debt. Basically selling our public roads, our bridges, our parking meters, our airports, our federal buildings, our water system, the sewage, and so on. Everything that is built and run by the federal or the local state government, they are advocating now to be sold into private hands. Even if we do that, the total value of all these public assets added together is 9.3 trillion, less than the amount we spent bailing the private banks out. Is this a good way to go? They argue, for example, Cato Institute argue this is the good way to go because if you privatize, that's where we can squeeze more profit out. Well, of course, they don't say that. They just say, it becomes more efficient and delivering more benefits to everyone. But the truth is that the moment we privatize a lot of things, we end up with greater inequality. For example, if we privatize schools, and we have already seen that, what it does is it has reduced social mobility. The great education, the really good teachers will go to the best privately funded school with higher salary and all the money. And the public schools end up with basically the dregs. And if you are always going to public school, you end up having a less chance of going to a good university or even attending university, getting a good job and improving your economic status. Similarly, what happens when you privatize banks? It led to concentration of wealth. If we ever privatize the internet, and we're getting closer and closer to that, it'll be the death of net neutrality. When we privatize government, we end up with oligarchy, which is what we're seeing happening a lot today. And of course, if we privatize healthcare, which we're doing right now, we're seeing that really good care goes to the rich, and the rest of us have to deal with a terrible system, an extremely expensive one. And finally, these three things put together, we end up with a systematically unsustainable structure. In fact, from 1970 to 2010, the world has witnessed 145 banking crises, 72 sovereign debt crises, and 208 monetary crises. These are from the IMF data, so I'm not making this up. This is really from the horse's mouth. So that means is more than 10 countries in crisis every year. Most of it you don't hear about, it doesn't get reported. So you imagine a system like that, how could this system possibly serve us? How could it possibly be any good other than for bailing out banks and making them richer and richer? And that is why a thinker like Bernard Later, now if you don't know him, I just give a very quick bio. Bernard was a very successful forex trader. He traded in foreign currency. So he used to be one of the bad guys. He did all these speculation, made tons of money. And then he became an academic in studying the monetary system. And he was one of the key architects of the euro, the currency that the European unions are using. So he really is up there with the big guys who really understand, who has his pulse on the pulse of policy. So from such a background, he has now turned around and becoming one of the strongest and loudest advocates for creating local currency and overhauling our monetary system. And this is what he says. In order to face the challenges of the 21st century, we need to rethink and overhaul our entire monetary system. This is a quote from the book Money and Sustainability, The Missing Link, which is in fact a Club of Rome report issued in 2012. If you remember, the Club of Rome issued another very famous report about the population growth in the world and how we need to stop that population growth or become unsustainable. And that was a very famous report that they did in the 70s. And now they have come up with the next report, and they have chosen it to be about money and sustainability. So we can see how important the Club of Rome thinks of this, and we really should also pay attention. Now, before going forward, I want to really pause for a moment and really want to think about a really big system view. And I entitled this A New Way Forward. Historically, we know communism does not work. We experimented with that in the 19th century, 20th century, because it collectivizes everything, which leads to state oppression. We all know this history. There's no need to elaborate. But right now, we also know that capitalism doesn't work because it tries to privatize everything. As I showed you just now, they want to privatize even all the public infrastructure. But when that happens, what it leads to is corporate oppression. So we end up with two poles. We either get oppressed by the state or we get oppressed by the corporations. And neither are things that we want to happen. And so we really need to find a new way forward. And the way is to balance these two. It's not to demonize communism, nor to demonize capitalism. They both hold certain truths. And it becomes useful to us if we let go of ideology and actually think how we can balance and harmonize them. Which means certain things are better to be collectivized. Public health, public education, and so on. And other things are better privatized. So we have private enterprise creating iPhones and creating technology and so on. And if we can harmonize these two and not let one destroy the other, and knowing which is which, that is when we can move forward with greater wisdom. And to that end, I want to talk more about how can we talk about that end, which is not privatization. The old language of collectivized communism is too fraught and doesn't work. So going forward, the new language that's been coming up right now more and more is to talk about the commons. And I want to think a little bit about what is the common. There are many different kinds of commons, and I'd like to share with you 3 kinds here. There are many more. First, the environmental commons. So these are things like clean air, clean water, fertile soil, fertile ocean. These are what Mother Earth provides naturally. This is what we are born with. This is our gifts that we're given as living things on this world, in this planet. So these are all the environmental commons that belongs to all living things on this planet. And then we have the human created civic commons. These are our laws and legal system, public education, public health, fire and disasters response system, and so on. There are many, many of these that's run by a collectivized effort, because such public goods are not something that is suited to be provided by private companies. Imagine what happens if we let private company run our legal system. It becomes one for extraction of profit rather than the delivery of justice. And the same thing can be said for public health and many other things. And some of these we're experimenting today. So that's civic commons. And finally, we have something called the economic commons. These are things like monetary system, legal system, not that, should be the civic. Money system, the free market, the banking system, the transportation, and so on and so forth. So these are things that we have built in order to run our economy. So these are the 3 commons that I would propose that are actually better to be in the hands of more collectivized rather than more privatized hands. And we can have a lot of discussion. This can be a very involved discussion about any of these topics, but I'll just let you do this introduction and move on from here. So given that I'm arguing that the money should be in our economic commons, let's think about how can we then create a monetary common that is good for everyone, not just for the private banks. So here are some characteristics I think would be good. Number 1, it should be 0 interest, because we just understood that the interest debt-bearing currencies was driving this incessant need for infinite growth. Second, it would be nice if it's created by user to fund real work, instead of being created by banks to fund housing and other asset speculation. So it would be nice if we have that characteristics too. Third, it would be good if it's backed by the user's own productivity and not by asset prices. Because we know if we have our money backed by asset prices, what happens? The incentive is always to drive up the asset prices. And you can see what happens when we use home prices to fund our money creation. We just have this crazy boom and bust cycle in the housing market. So we don't want that. We want it to be backed by our own productivity, which means if we are more productive, if we work harder, we produce more economic goods, then there's more money available, and that's how it should be. And if we decide not to, there'll be less money. And also it'll be very important for it to be limited by local environmental sustainability. That way, we are not exporting our waste to pollute other people's environment while thinking that it's okay to do so because we don't experience any of the negative effect from our pollution. If we can have a money that will force us to think locally and experience the impact, the environmental impact of pollution, of waste, then it will really create a positive feedback for us to be mindful of the environment as we develop our economic system. And finally, very important, it cannot be used for financial gains, for speculation, as we saw in the example previously. This will be the kind of money that's only used to fund real work for real exchange of value. That way, there will be no extraction by speculators. So there'll be a few that you can list, probably many others as well, but these are the few that I think are really fundamental for a monetary common that is good for everyone. One of the system, there are many ways of doing it, to satisfy these criteria, but I think the best one I've seen so far is something called a mutual credit system. A lot of the things we're familiar with today actually are mutual credit system. For example, time banks, lead system, barter exchange, and so on. The difference between these are really not the fundamentals, structure and design, but who they serve. Lets and time bank generally tend to be C2C, consumer to consumer. So it's really serving people who are not in businesses, who maybe, let's say, who can walk, talk, teach you Spanish, teach you how to play guitar, and so on, massage, and doing the exchanges with each other. So helping a community, helping each other with chores. But you also have something called a barter system, exchange system, of which the VIA in Switzerland is one of them. And that tends to be confined to helping businesses. It's a B2B function, helping businesses trade their excess inventory and barter the things that they can't sell for the things that they need. What we are trying to do then is to combine all these different kind of mutual credit system and say, well, we don't need to limit ourselves to just B2B or just C2C. In fact, what we're trying to do when we design Baybak is to make it work for all three, B2B, B2C, and C2C. And that way, we have an integrated local monetary system that can serve everyone. So let me go a little bit more into barter exchange and examine if the barter exchange model can satisfy the various criteria I listed earlier for what a monetary common should have. So first thing, it can be a zero interest. Now, a note here, a lot of commercial barter exchanges do not operate a zero interest currency. They actually have interest rate for debt. But at Baybak, when we borrow this model, we tweaked it so that it's a zero interest. So in Baybak, no debt has any interest. Second, a barter exchange can also be limited by the local environment. Again, the commercial barter exchanges generally do not. They would trade with anyone, and their membership would be national and sometimes even global. But at Baybak, we have made a conscious decision to limit our membership to only local businesses and eventually local residents as well. And in that way, we consciously limit the impact of the use of this currency to the local environment so that it can be really, the link can be very strong. And third, money is created by user to fund real needs. This is the characteristics of all barter exchanges, commercial and otherwise. And the remaining three are all the same. Backed by users' own productivity, same thing. The commercial one or Baybak's the same. And it's not used for financial speculation. Again, the same thing. And so we can see that the barter exchange model, if we tweak it slightly so that the first two criteria are met, is actually a very good fit to what we envision a good monetary common to be. And so a little bit more about our Baybak's implementation then. So we started with a B2B model, which is really almost indistinguishable from a commercial barter exchange other than a few points, and there are a few others too that we tweaked. So we started with that, a B2B, and we are planning to expand to B2C when the number of businesses in our network reaches about 2,000 or so. And eventually we will expand to C2C when the number of resident users in our network reaches about 1,000. So that's the the implementation plan for Baybucks. Okay, now since I'm trying to persuade all of you guys to really consider creating a local currency of your own, I need to also tell you about the difficulties of doing so. There's a few. These are the three that I can think of straight off, the most prominent when we were doing it. The first is it takes work to persuade your local businesses to join. This is something new. Everyone is very conditioned to using cash, so to tell them that they will sell things for not cash, for local currency that is not convertible to cash. Okay, there are other local currency systems where they make it convertible, and that will make it much easier to persuade businesses to join. But we have decided that because we want to cut our ties with this very dysfunctional monetary system we have today, Baybucks is not convertible. And so by making that decision, it becomes pretty hard to persuade businesses to join. It's not impossible because, and we know that in order to make it easier for us, that's why we model ourselves after the commercial barter exchange, so that we can point to a successful model which has been running, for example, the Swiss via since the 1930s. So there are many well-functioning commercial barter exchanges around the country and around the world. So we can point to them and say, look, this is not such a stretch. We're not asking you to do something completely revolutionary. So that way we can go some ways in persuading businesses to join. Second, public education or deprogramming is a constant necessity. By that I mean, again, because we are so trained to believe that cash is king, that cash is real, we look at a piece of green paper and we think this is real value. It is very difficult to deprogram that and say, actually, no, if you think about it, this is something that is printed piece of paper that the Fed just cranks out. And the Fed, for the last couple of years in quantitative easing, has been cranking out billions of these every month. These are just paper. And the more they crank it out, the less it's worth. It's not backed by anything at all. It's just a printing press. So this thing we call cash that we believe has real value, in fact, has zero value other than the value we choose to give it. Whereas if you use a local currency that the creators are us, ourselves, and we are backing it with our own goods and services, this money is more real because it's truly backed by something tangible, some true economic productivity, unlike the fiat cash currency we have. But this is a very difficult conversation to have. And so it's a constant necessity to do and to educate our public. And finally, work is front-loaded. If you want to implement a local currency the way we have designed it and implement it, there's a lot of work up front before you can start enjoying the fruits of it. So these are the difficulties you need to keep in mind and to design for it in your process so that you will not come upon it and then be flawed by that. But we also need to balance by the advantages. If you do it this way, there are quite a few advantages. One is, once the system is up and running, it becomes easier to grow because it's more or less self-sustaining. And then as you grow it, you just get reaping more and more benefit. There is no uphill battle that you keep trying to make it work. I'll give you a little more explanation of what I mean by that. I'm contrasting this with typically the kind of local currency that gets done, which is a convertible kind, where you take US dollars, you buy a local currency, and you spend it with the local businesses, and the local businesses can convert that local currency back into cash. If you do that system, you find that it is very hard to grow it. Why? Because the moment someone uses this local currency, it gets converted back into cash, and you have to work really hard to get that converted back into the local currency again. You have to get people willing to buy it again. And it becomes a kind of Sisyphean task. Every time you put some money out there, you want it to be used, the moment it's used, it's gone. It's converted back into cash. Whereas if you do not allow the conversion back into cash, the more it gets used, the more local currencies are available and more people using it, and you can truly grow it in terms of the impact. Now, the other thing we did, and a decision we make, is not to pay any salary. So every team member actually on 100% commission. So they don't make any money until they help members make money first. But by having it this way, that makes it almost risk-free to add more team member and to help grow it faster. And once you have a certain momentum and growth and usage, Baybucks is not just a monetary common, it's also a platform for creating living wage job. So it serves another purpose. And finally, by doing it from business first and then slowly getting into local resident, what we will have then is a very easy launch when you want to launch it for local resident, because there's no need to convince businesses to accept the local currency and to spend it themselves anymore. They have already been trained way before we actually launch it for local residents to use it. So that way, when you come to the B2C and the C2C launch, it is simple. We have done all the work. It's been front-loaded. The work has all been done previously, and it just gets easier and easier as you move it along. So here are the characteristics then of a local currency implemented as a mutual credit system and with various tweaks to it and modeled after a barter exchange. If we do that, what do we get? We get something that's legal. And there's a lot of discussion about what is legal and not legal and so on, especially with currency that's convertible to US dollar. There is a Money Transmitter Act now that actually catch them under that and say that is, you have to comply with a lot of MTA requirements. It makes it very difficult to run a local currency. But if you do it in the mutual credit way, it becomes totally legal and you're not caught under MTA. It is non-inflationary. There's no hoarding of money. There's 0% interest money, so there's no transferring of wealth to the top 0.1%. It's very easy to use. It is self-sustaining, as I was saying, and there's no scarcity. That's huge, because money, if all of us can create the money as and when we need it based on our own willingness to work and to pay back, there's no scarcity. And there's no free riding either. It's collaborative, it's local, it's robust, it is safe, and it's self-correcting. By self-correcting, what I mean is, if there is need for more money because there's a lot of transaction that needs to happen, there's a lot of needs that need to be filled, we all just simply create that money, and then all these transaction gets done. If there's less need and there's not as much transaction, not enough stuff that needs to be exchanged and traded, we don't create that money. And so the money supply actually shrinks. And that's how we can actually naturally control the inflation and deflation. The money supply takes care of that itself. So that is the money that's designed to be stable instead of having these boom bust cycle and these high and low inflation cycle. There you go. So that is let me go back. That is the end of the presentation. And I'm happy to take any questions that any of our live audience here might have.
Great, thank you so much, Chong. That was really a very insightful way to kind of break down the whole thing, scale problem in a very simple. I have a couple questions that came in here. One being just around some of your stats at the beginning. Those were some really disturbing numbers. The thing about derivative trade being 9 times the global GDP, as well as that the laws make it that that's the first thing to get paid back. A question around, I'm wondering if you could explain a little more about what derivative trade is. How does that work?
Sure. Derivative trade basically means that if you can think about the stock market first, right? I think most of us understand the stock market. Derivative is next step up. So stock market is, for example, Apple Computer, right? When they have listed the Apple stock that is traded in the stock market, and each of us can buy a few shares of Apple stock as and when we want it, which in turns means that we own a little tiny piece of Apple Computer. And when Apple Computer makes money, it will either pay us dividend, that's how we make money, or the prices of Apple stock will go up. And then we make money that way. So that is stock trading. I think most of us understand that. Derivative trade is to say, well, I don't really want to own the stock, but I'm going to game it. I will say, if the Apple stock goes up by $10, then you will pay me a certain amount. If it goes down by $10, I will pay you a certain amount. So let's have a side agreement, a side bet, so to speak. So derivative is really, you can think of it as a side bet from the actual gaming table. All right. And so I basically write, so it's actually one-to-one. So I'm writing a contract against someone else. And this other person agrees that if this is what happened to the stock price, this amount of money will change hand. So it is not the actual stock trade, but it's a derivative of that. Do you see that? So that's what the name derivative means. It is based on the actual Apple stock, but no actual Apple stock ever changes hand. It is something else based on what happens to the stock price. Okay? Now, the thing about actual stock when you trade it is there's only that many stock, right? Apple maybe, let's say, issue a billion stock. So you can only buy a billion. That's it. If you have enough money, you buy 100% of Apple stock, you own it all. But that is it. You can't buy more than that. The thing about derivative is there's no stopping 100, 200, a few thousand people from making similar bets on the one stock. So that opens up that market. That's why it can be 9 times global GDP, because it is not limited by the total number of Apple stock. The total side bets on Apple stock price could exceed the total value of Apple as a company. Okay? That is how the derivative trade can become so uncontrollable, because it is derivative. It's not limited by the actual number of shares that's existing. There's no limit to the amount of side bets you can make. Does that explain it somehow to help you understand what is derivative and why there's so much of it and why it's such a big problem? And the reason why the law was made such that derivative trader gets paid first was because of lobby. Of course, everything else it happens because of lobby. When the derivative was first invented by Wall Street, they said this is such a great instrument. It actually helps to even out risk. It's actually a risk management instrument. It's not a speculative instrument, blah, blah, blah. But in order to help this new instrument become more widely adopted and used, we must encourage its use. And one way of encouraging it is to make them first in line for payment. And so, they did lobby and all that. And so the federal government made that law. Now, of course, this is so huge. It's bigger than anything else. We really should get rid of that law. It is still on the books, and that makes it really frightening.
Thank you for that explanation. Very, very thorough. Yeah, it's really astounding to think that we have this huge global monetary system that's just based on infinite wealth, which is just mind-boggling to me. I'm curious what you think about. I mean, where is it going to go? Like it can't. What does when the bubble bursts? What does that look like? What actually happens? What would be the response? What would be the alternatives? What would happen? I guess like almost happened in 2008, and like you had said, the bailout was 14 trillion, which was nearly as much as the entire U.S. GDP. So, how can they keep doing this? I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but you kind of know what I'm getting at, right? Like what? It's got to burst at some point. What do you think?
Oh yeah, it has been bursting. We've been cutting it up. If you remember, if you think back, the first major financial crisis we experienced in the modern world is the savings and loan crisis, right? And that caused a lot of suffering, and then they got bailed out. And then what happened? The bailing out is just basically taking private debt and making it public debt. That's what is really happening.
Yeah, so at some point, they're just not going to be able to bail them out. There just won't be enough. So what happens then?
Right. So we kept doing that. And the dot-com was the same thing. Now the subprime was the same thing. What happens next time? That's the secret. Now they are realizing that the next time is going to be so big, there won't be enough money to bail them out. So they're now doing a bail-in. I don't know if you heard about that. It happened in Cyprus. When the Cyprus financial crisis hit and the banking system fell, they did a bail-in, which means instead of the Cyprus government coming up with money to assume all that private banking debt into the public debt, they did not have that money. They make all the depositors take a haircut. Well, in fact, they said depositor above, I think, 100K will have to take a haircut, and a very severe one. So they basically confiscated depositors' money. They are making rules now so that any banks that fails within the EU will have to resort to the bail-in mechanism. And there have been a lot of talk. I can't remember if the law has been passed, but I remember reading a lot of talks and discussion that the same thing will happen here in the US. And so, in fact, what this tells me is the money in the bank is not safe anymore. If you're saving your retirement saving, you're too afraid to put it into the stock market because it's been crashing. Like me, I took it all out. It just crashed on me so many times. I'm dead scared of it. I'm not going to touch it. So if you save money by putting it in the bank in a fixed deposit, well, that is subject to bail-in. So yes, the next time it happens is going to be even more gruesome.
Wow, that's a very scary thought. Essentially, we'll just take the money. Or I suppose ultimately what will happen, and maybe we've seen this happen in some countries where bubble bursts so bad and just that the currency just loses its value completely. In which case, we are then forced to go back into a system that's more local currency, that's more barter system, that's valuing real tangible assets like goods and services.
So, sorry, can you? It's very hard to hear you, Jay. Can you speak a little louder or slower?
Sure, sorry about that. Is this coming through any better right now?
Yes, it's better now.
I was saying, so ultimately when the bubble really does burst, the currency would eventually completely lose its value, like has happened at some countries at certain times of the world, right? And then we would essentially be forced anyway to go back to local currency, to bartering systems, to actually valuing in the resources in our local region, like tangible goods and services.
Yes, exactly that. Exactly that. And we've seen it happen many times, right? In Indonesia, in Argentina, in Russia, in Brazil. You just name it. There's just so many, just endless. It will happen to the US. And the reason being that the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency is weakening very rapidly right now. More and more countries are recognizing that the US has spent way beyond its means. Public debt is far higher than it can really seriously pay off. And so they are moving away from using the US dollar as a global trade currency. The EU, the euro is somewhat trying to replace it, but I think even more serious challenge is actually the renminbi from China. And the Chinese renminbi has become a global currency now. And they are actually saying that they will not allow the conversion of the US dollars into renminbi because they are afraid that people holding too much US dollar and knowing that the crash on the US dollar will come will try to convert into Chinese currency, which is gold backed right now. China has bought out enormous amount of gold, and the renminbi is I don't know if it's entirely gold back, but it's a large percentage of this gold back. And so they don't want other people to dump US dollar on them and take and convert. So they are saying that you're not allowed to do that. So yes, the crash of unthinkable as it is, the crash of the US dollar can come, and the various pillar propping the value of the US dollar up is going away one by one.
Wow, you're saying that China is actually, they have limits on how much US dollars you can convert into the Chinese yen. Is that what you're saying? So they're already kind of seeing this coming and planning for it.
Right. Yeah, and Chinese basically making a play that more and more global trade will be denominated in yen and not in dollar. And so what's going to happen to the dollar when suddenly no one needs it to do global trade anymore? They'll try to convert it to the next one, which is yen, in order to continue the global trade. And so China is actually now saying, no, you cannot convert. I'm not allowing conversion from the US into yen. And so, yeah, when more and more countries start adopting the yen as a global trading currency, you'll start seeing some really significant downward pressure on the US dollar.
So what do you think will happen here in this country to the people here, to the economy here, when and if
Number one is runaway inflation, because when the value of US dollars goes down and we import so much of our goods now, because our manufacturing has basically all left the country, right? It has all been outsourced to China, to India, to all these other low-wage countries. And so we import way more. And when the value of the US dollar goes down, the first thing you notice is all the imported goods and services will shoot up and inflation will go right up. And that will, of course, then drive your domestic inflation as well. Because, if a foreign car is worth now 3 times as much, the local car can actually jack their prices up at least 1.5 times, right? So that whole inflation would start skyrocketing. As we see in many other countries in history, it's not as if this is a mystery or anything. This has happened countless times.
Well, on a positive note, perhaps something like that in this kind of financial crisis and the system of ever exponentially increasing debt may create, in that crisis, there could be an opportunity that's really going to support more local economy, more sustainability, organic gardening, people taking back into their own hands sustainable production means and other managing their land and their agriculture and their water. So anyway, at least that is my hope, that this can all be a wake up to really stimulate creating local regional abundance.
Yes, and my hope is that we don't have to suffer so great a pain before we start doing so. I mean, we are intelligent people. We can see things happening in other parts of the world. We know it's going to happen here in the US. So let's do something about it while we actually have the resources to do it. Now, this is the best time to do it because we are not suffering so much yet. We have a lot of resources at our disposal. Channel that to building the next stage of the economy. Don't wait until the massive collapse had hit you. By then, we are all scrambling to survive. No one will have the energy, the excess energy, to build a public good. Now is the time that we can do so. So I would strongly urge anyone who's listening to this to start thinking about, okay, let me build my own local currency right now, while I still can.
Thank you for those encouraging words. But maybe let's have time for one more question, going back toward about the actual local currency, which you seem to feel is one of the most proactive, effective things we can do given the problem. So I'm curious what you said about. If you could talk more about the mutual credit system. You mentioned something about that there's lots of different laws regarding making a local currency, and the way to do it legally is to do it with a mutual credit system. Could you talk more about those laws and how that works for people that might be interested in?
Sure. Yeah, sure. There are two main areas of law that impacts local currency. One is the law about taxation, the IRS tax code, and the other are things like the Bank Secrecy Act, the Money Transmitter Act. That's the other part. Are you still there, Jay? I suddenly lost you.
Still here, yet. I was just trying to.
Okay, good. So these are two. So let me cover them in turn. The first is the IRS tax code. The tax code basically says that we are responsible to report all income, including barter income. So even though the income is not in cash, as long as it has a cash value, we must report it. So for example, if you make your income in local currency, it has a cash value, and you have to report that. Or even if you just do a bartering, like if I walk your dog, you pick up my grocery or whatever. Not so much that, but let's say if you barter, let's say if I walk your dog, you give me 2,000 eggs. So in that case, from the IRS point of view, the 2,000 egg has a market value. And so you must report income on the 2,000 egg, convert it into a cash value and report that as your income. Now, the problem with that tax reporting requirement is that when you run a local currency, everyone using it must report their income in that local currency. And it can get very onerous. Most of us don't track our income in, well, let's be honest, in cash, much less in the local currency. And so having to report that, or else we may get into trouble, or sometimes the people running the local currency may get into trouble, is a difficult thing to have. Time banks get around it by getting private letter ruling from the IRS. They exempt them from having to report tax. But the most private letter rulings stipulate very clearly that then all the exchanges happening in the time bank cannot have monetary value. Meaning, if you truly insist that 1 hour of legal lawyer time is equivalent to 1 hour of dog walking time, then it's not taxable. But the moment you differentiate, and especially when you have physical goods, when you have eggs and bread and whatever in there, then this thing does not no longer hold. So there is this legal gray area here that is very troublesome, and we need to look into it much more carefully. So that's one in terms of taxation, which can be a deterrent for people using it because of a reporting requirement, and a deterrent for people running it because they might end up getting, IRS will go after them for not complying with the tax law. The second part are the things like the bank secrecy and the MTA, which really deals with money laundering. What they're trying to do is prevent money laundering. And it really was in response to Bitcoin and these other crypto. But the long and short of it is it defines any money transmitter, any instrument as a money transmitter if you can convert it into the US dollars and convert it back freely, either both ways. When that is what you're doing, you are defined by the federal and most state regulation as a money transmitter. That carries with it a lot of onerous reporting requirement. And some of the most onerous are, for example, the one required by the New York state. If you are defined as a money transmitter, you have to post a bond, and the bond, I think, is $1 million. So you actually need to have $1 million sitting somewhere in the bank account for you to even run local currency in New York if you want to do it in convertible fashion. So these are huge obstacle. The way around it is that what I've discovered is there twofold. One, because you can petition the federal and the local and the state government and carving out local currency as a separate thing that's not covered by MTA. And so there are some efforts in doing that, and to varying degree of success. Some are very open, like I think, if I'm not mistaken, North Carolina is very open. It totally carved it out, and New York is not. It defines everything that has any conversion as covered under the MTA. So there's this problem. What I found the easiest way to get around it is to actually use the mutual credit system, especially the barter exchange model, because the barter exchange industry had already petitioned the federal government in, I think, in the early 80s, 1983, yeah. That's when TIFRA Act was passed. That's a tax code that was passed that very clearly carved out and defined barter exchanges as third-party record keeper. And so what it says is basically IRS says, we want our pound of flesh. And the barter industry say, yes, we'll collaborate with you and give it to you. And so all barter system now, the legal ones, report tax to the IRS through something called the 1099B form. So IRS created a special form, 1099B, B for standing for barter, which allows barter exchanges to report taxes to the IRS. And in return, IRS totally recognize the legitimacy of their model. And so there'll never be any question about you running an illegal local currency system if you use the barter exchange model and report to IRS as such. And that's what we discovered, and that's what we did. And that got rid of the whole legal hurdle for us.
So in that model, if you're using the barter exchange model, it's not like everyone who's a user of the currency needs to fill out a 1099B. That's just something that kind of the currency host organization does and reports that in some kind of way?
No. What it is we will create a 1099B for them. So our software generates 1099B for all our users. So all they need to do is just get a 1099B, just like they get 1099 miscellaneous from freelance work and all that. So just one extra 1099 form. So it's very easy for you to just add to your tax return. There's no extra.
So it's the responsibility of the individual businesses or users for income that they make from that currency to then report that to IRS.
That's correct. Yeah, we have to do that. We have to give IRS this pound of flesh. But because we have the software from bar exchange network that does all that work for you, and it becomes transparently easy. You're just getting one more 1099, and most of us have one or two because we do freelance work a lot. So we just get one more 1099 and we just throw it in as we normally would in a tax form. So that becomes pretty effortless to satisfy the IRS and also to become absolutely legal. So that's a little trade-off we do, but I think it's worth it.
Well, thank you. It sounds like a real intelligent way to, like you said in the title, transition into a new system, and that there's pathways in the current system that allow to do that. So,
yes.
Thank you so much, Chong. Well, do you want to end? It's been about an hour. We're about out of time. Do you want to leave people with some resources they can learn more about you, learn more about Baybucks?
Come to our Baybucks website and our blog and so on. There's some resources there. And of course, feel free to email me. My email, I flashed it just now, but I'll give it to you again, is cktan, that's C for Charlie, K for Kangaroo. Tan is spelled T for Tango, A for Alpha, N for November, so cktan, at baybucks.com. Baybucks spelled with an S.com. So feel free to email me, and if you have any questions or if you want to start something, I'll be happy to help.
Great, thank you so much, Chong. So again, if you want to learn more about local currencies or in the Bay Area or in another area and looking at a real good, healthy model of a bi-regional currency, check out, again, baybucks.com. I want to thank all of our listeners for watching, for tuning in, and also thank our partners and sponsors and Empowerment Works, Living Mandala, Unofficial Magazine North America, the Global Summit, and the Building Resilient Communities Convergence. So stay tuned for more episodes with maintaining solutions from the leading edge around this and many other topics. So thanks again. Thank you so much again, Chong, for your time.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Okay. Signing off. Bye-bye.